Hello, in this video I will show you how to set up an automated workflow to create a contact in Mailchimp from a form submitted on a Wix website. We will build a very simple Procesio process that contains only one action. The process will be triggered by a webhook coming from Wix when someone submits a contact form. The data received is then pushed by Procesio to Mailchimp to create a new contact. I have created a free Wix account. I have deployed a test website for a band using a Wix template. Nothing complicated so far. Let's have a look at the website. As you can see, it is pretty neat out of the box. Now let's add a contact page to have a contact form that our visitors could fill. Back to the Wix dashboard, click Edit Site at the top right. In the editor, I click on Page and Menu in left toolbar. Then I add a contact page from one of the template proposed. I am renaming and placing it at the bottom of the list. I am saving the modifications and publishing the website. I can now preview it. Back in edit mode, you can see that we have a Wix form object in the page. We are done with the website and are ready to link the form with Procesio. Now it is time to create the webhook that will send the contact details from the form to Procesio. On the Wix dashboard, click on Automation. Then click on New Automation at the top right. Then select the From Scratch option. You can see different options, and obviously I select Wix Forms as the trigger of this automation. Then I select the contact form created earlier. For the action, I choose the Send via Webhook option. It requires a target URL to send the contact details. We will create a webhook endpoint in Procesio and come back just here after to input the endpoint URL. Let's go to Procesio and create a new process. I rename it by double-clicking on its title. Now I am creating a new webhook. It will be our entry point to receive the data form Wix. It is very simple, it just requires a name. We don't save it for now, but we copy the webhook URL to paste it back in Wix to finish the automation configuration. Back in Wix, I paste the webhook URL and finally I click on Activate and name the webhook to finish the configuration. We are done and now we can test and check if we receive the form's data in Procesio. So I open my Wix website and navigate to the contact page. I input some fake first name, last name, and email address. But before clicking on Send, I go back to my Procesio process to start listening to the webhook. So when I will submit the form on Wix, it will automatically create a JSON object that fits the JSON structure received from Wix. Then I can save the webhook. And we are all set with the Wix and webhook parts. Now we just need to assign this webhook to our process so it can trigger it automatically. And as you see, it creates for us a JSON variable that we could access later. Now let's go to Mailchimp. I've created a free Mailchimp account for this tutorial. When creating an account, Mailchimp creates an audience. It is like a group of contacts with common interest. What we want is to create a contact in this audience for each form submitted on Wix. Let's have a look at the Mailchimp documentation to understand how to post the data from Procesio to Mailchimp. In the Send Marketing Campaigns section, click on Documentation. Then click on Guides and Marketing API Quick Start to find some info about the generation of an API key. You need a key when submitting a request to Mailchimp. Then you can have a look at Create Your First Audience, and finally add a contact to an audience section. This is the info we need to understand how to create a contact. We will come back to this documentation in a few minutes. But let's start by generating our Mailchimp API key. Go to your profile, then Extra, and finally API Keys. Then click on Create a New Key and give a meaningful name to your key for easy reference. Finally, click on Generate Key. Here, be careful and save this key somewhere, because after leaving this page you won't be able to see this key again. For the purpose of this tutorial, I will copy it in another Chrome tab. Normally you must keep your key private. Now you can click on Done, and voila! Your key is generated and ready to use. Now we go back to the documentation to understand how to format our request to Mailchimp. As you can see, we need to send a post request. The API URL is also given. Some parameters in the URL must be adapted to your context. The API server parameter corresponds to the location assigned to you by Mailchimp and can be easily found in your account URL. For me, I must enter US 21. The second important parameter is the ID of your audience list. This one is not easy to find, but I will show how to do it. And the last parameter to configure is of course the API key we've just generated. And finally, you can see the simple JSON structure expected in the post request. So let's see how to get the ID of our audience list. It is not clear in the documentation. The solution is to send a GET request to the Mailchimp API to request all your list's information. Here, I am using a free online tools to send a request. I've pasted the endpoint URL to get my list's details. Then I am clicking on the Authorization tab and selecting Basic Authorization. As a username, I can input anything, but for the password I have to input my Mailchimp API key. So I copy and paste my key here. Finally, I select the GET method and send the request. And here is our list ID. So now, we have everything to prepare our post request to Mailchimp to create a contact. Back to my Procesio process, I am now dragging a call API action and rename it for clarity. For every call API action, you have to create or assign a credential. I am creating here a new Mailchimp credential. I give it a name and select REST API. Then I click Next Step to continue the configuration. For the URL, I have to input the API URL found in the Mailchimp documentation. I copy and paste the URL. Then I select the get method and finally basic authentication. Here again I input a username and I paste my Mailchimp API key for the password. Now I can test the connection. But it fails because I forgot to update the API server parameter in the URL with my server location, US 21. I fix it and I test again. Now it is a success and I can save my credentials configuration. Now I am assigning this credential to my call API action and continue with its configuration. I select the post method as described in the Mailchimp documentation. For the endpoint, I go back again to the Mailchimp documentation and copy it. I paste it back in Procesio. Here you see that we must update the list ID with our own list ID. So I copy it from the response we got earlier. And I paste it back in Procesio. Finally, we must add the JSON payload in the body section. So back in the Mailchimp documentation again, I copy the JSON example given and paste it back in Procesio. Now I am updating the email, first name and last name values with the data received from the Wix webhook. The different variables names accessible from this webhook JSON are self-explanatory, so I am confident and I am not checking the Wix documentation. But normally you'd better check. By pressing Command+I on a Mac, you can access to all the variables of your process and include them in your payload. Now I am finalizing the configuration by adding a status code variable. It is not mandatory but can help to debug or add other logics after the call if needed. Our process configuration is now almost completed and I can save it. Now I am connecting all the nodes and I save. I don't want to run it, because if you remember well, it must be automatically triggered by the Wix webhook. So I am testing the process by submitting a form in Wix. I am checking if the process ran well in Procesio. So far everything is okay. And finally, I am checking if the new contact has been created in Mailchimp. As you can see, after reloading the Mailchimp page, everything works fine. I hope you find this video useful.